Okay, let's get started, everybody. Well, welcome to my bedroom. This is my headboard. I am in Mexico. I'm surrounded by alebrijas, the spirit animals of Mexico, which is a sort of interesting metaphor for the times we're living in right now, which is, do we have dreams or do we have nightmares in this era? So this is, I'm in this particular location, partly because I live in Mexico in southern Baja, about an hour north of Cabo San Lucas on the Pacific Ocean side, in an area called Todos Santos, Pescadero. And the Wi-Fi in this area can be sort of dodgy at times, and it's actually best here in my bed, which is not a good thing. You don't want to have great Wi-Fi in your bed, frankly. But I wanted to make sure that I could come through to you. So what I'm going to talk about today, and then I'm going to really open it up for Q&A because I would love to hear have a conversation with you, is how do you approach these kind of times with a growth mindset? And I'll explain what a growth mindset is for those who don't know it. I'll talk a little bit about my history and where I am today. And how I'm trying to apply a growth mindset today, as well as maybe how you could consider it yourself. So save up your questions. If you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But what I'll probably do is talk for about 20 minutes and then open it up for Q&A at that point. So that's as opposed to taking questions along the way. All right, thumbs up, yes? All right. Sounds like it's good. All right. So for those who don't know my background, I started a boutique hotel company called Joie de Vivre at age 26, ran it for 24 years, created 52 boutique hotels, became the second largest boutique hotelier in the US. Based in San Francisco, most of our hotels, actually all of our hotels during the time I was there were in California. To be honest with you, what led me to selling the company was what had been a calling for me became a job. And it happened almost overnight. It happened primarily because in the Great Recession, I was going through like, oh shit, we're gonna go through our second once in a lifetime downturn in the same decade. And I came to realize I didn't want to do that anymore. In many ways, I did not have a growth mindset. I had a fixed mindset. I had a growth mindset for the dot-com bust 9/11 period. But I had a fixed mindset going into the recession. So what is the difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset? So all of this comes from and was popularized by a woman named Carol Dweck, psychologist from Stanford, who basically said, in studying children initially and then expanding to adults, that we can have multiple mindsets in our lives. So you could have a fixed mindset in your romantic life, or in your marriage. You could have a growth mindset in your career. You could have a fixed mindset in spirituality and religion. You could have a growth mindset in athleticism. So no one person necessarily has a fixed or growth mindset across their whole life. But what she said was a fixed mindset is predominant. More people have fixed mindsets than growth mindsets. So the average person has a fixed mindset in their life, in the various parts of their life. A fixed mindset is based upon the premise that you have to prove yourself. It's almost like you have a finite amount of talent and skill in the world, and your job is to go out and prove yourself by winning. And by so doing, it allows you to build self-esteem and feel better about yourself and maybe build that confidence. Now, I mean, I'll speak for myself, but maybe for many of you, well, isn't that how our life was? Isn't that how we were brought up? Weren't we brought up in our teen years or even earlier that our thing was to go out and do well in school, do well in athletics, do well in our hobbies or art or whatever, volunteerism. And by doing so, you felt like you were a better person. Well, the challenge with the fixed mindset, which is based upon the premise that you're trying to prove yourself and the definition of success is winning, is that it defines yourself based upon winning. So what happens is you get older. When you're younger, you have a tendency, younger, let's say you're younger than an adult, you're willing to mess up. I mean, nobody was very self-conscious about walking for the first time at age 1 or 2 because they weren't worried about everybody watching. It's like, everybody leave the room. I'm going to try to walk now. No, you weren't very self-conscious. And then we got into a self-consciousness in our teen years, no doubt. But as we got to our adulthood, you felt more and more like you were supposed to have, excuse the expression, but you're supposed to have your shit together. And therefore, you're not supposed to look like an awkward young thing learning something new. So what happens is if we adopt in adulthood a fixed mindset, what that leads to is a smaller and smaller sandbox in which we play in. Why is that? It's partly because as we get older, there's certain things we don't do as well. It starts with athleticism sometimes it has to do with, brain power things in terms of memory. And as we get more and more focused on only doing the things that we know we can do well and win, not only do we become more bored, but our life becomes more narrow. And as our life becomes more narrow, our perspective on life becomes more narrow. And it becomes a self-fulfilling negative prophecy. And it's particularly painful in a pandemic or a depression or a recession, because during those times, the nature of the times themselves are going to test us. So just know that in times, I'm a big Maslow fan, in times of difficult economic times, difficult conditions, uncertainty, we often go to the bottom of Maslow's pyramid, focusing on our physiological and safety needs, our survival needs. So what's the opposite of that? What's a growth mindset? So Carol Dweck talks about a growth mindset being the difference between a fixed mindset where you're proving yourself. In a growth mindset, you're trying to improve yourself. So what does that mean? It means that success is not winning, success is learning. And so if your point of view is that you have a growth mindset, you're less focused on whether you're winning or how you look to other people. Because you're less focused on proving yourself. You're more focused on improving yourself. Now, all of that sounds quite simple in theory. In practice, it's a lot harder. As somebody who's now 59 years old, I am learning Spanish for the first time. I grew up with French, and as my junior high school and high school years were French. And I'm learning how to surf. And I can promise you, learning to surf at 59 is sort of like learning to walk at age 1 or 2. It doesn't look pretty, and people are pointing at me and laughing at the old guy trying to surf. But one of the things I've learned and studied is, how do people learn? How do people keep learning when it's hard to learn? And one of the most important lessons is you need to learn how to laugh. If you can actually have a fun time and you can enjoy your process of learning, as I do with my Spanish teacher, I'm actually not taking myself so seriously. I'm not so self-critical. I'm not focused on proving myself to her that I'm smart. Yes, I am in a one-on-one with her, which makes me feel more comfortable. Similarly, I'm not very good at yoga. I'm great at meditation. I've always loved meditation, but it's because I close my eyes and I'm not comparing myself. In a yoga class, I'm constantly comparing myself. So I have a fixed mindset about yoga, which is somehow I'm trying to prove myself as someone who's generally not very limber, has really tight hamstrings, and is surrounded by people who seem to be much more limber. And so I said, listen, my way to learn that is to get a one-on-one coach, one-on-one yoga trainer, and work with that person directly so that I didn't have to worry about how do I look. So one of the things we need to learn in any times, but particularly in a downturn like this, is how do we move in the direction of improvement and growth? And let's know that sometimes the way that we're going to do that, we have to figure out what's the right form of educating ourselves. For me, with both Spanish, for surfing, I've gotten used to the idea, listen, I'm out there in the way. You can't sort of go and say, I'm going to do a surf lesson and no one else will be around. You have to sort of say, okay, I'm going to surf with a bunch of other people out there and I'm going to look stupid, but I'm going to have fun. If I don't laugh at least 5 times at myself when I'm out there surfing, I didn't have a good surf lesson or didn't have a good surf experience. Now that's an unusual way to think about surfing. It's like, okay, surfing is laughing. Well, when I have that point of view and I can get to that place where I don't think of surfing as somehow an indictment, or my lack of surfing skill as an indictment of me as a human. I'm not trying to prove myself. I've learned actually how to get better at surfing, because I just, instead of getting focused on the fear of how it looks, I get more focused on how can I improve and how can I have fun along the way. So how does all this apply to our work life and to our careers right now? Well, the first thing to know is that there's something to be learned. You know, one of the things I learned from long ago was that we are learning lessons every week. I mean, whether we know it or not, we are in a position where we are in the process of learning something. And when in our most painful and most challenging times of learning, the questions we need to ask ourselves is, what did I learn this week? So when I was 26 and I started Joie de Vivre, I created a wisdom book. And every weekend, at the end of the week, I would go to my wisdom book and I would write down 3 or 4 bullet points of key things I'd learned that week. Usually they're the things that were painful, that were hard to learn. And I would write them down and I'd sort of chronicle them. And the next week I'd do it again. And when I was in really rough times, San Francisco went through an earthquake in 1989. We had no business. I was in my wisdom book more than once a week. .com bust, yep. 9/11, yep. The Great Recession, yep. Sold the company, went to go work for Airbnb, spent 4 years helping to steer the rocket ship with the Airbnb founders. Did a lot of writing in my next set of wisdom books. I have 8 sets of books now that are my wisdom books. What's the point of this? Well, the point of this is, wow, some of our greatest learning comes from our most difficult times. And yet we do very little to metabolize and chronicleize what we're learning along the way. I can tell you, when I went through the Great Recession and realized I didn't want to be running that company anymore, and I looked back at my key learnings from the .com bust 9/11, which was, you know, about 5-6 years earlier, I noticed that I seemed like I was a bit of a gladiator. I was in such a mode that I wanted to learn, and I was really pumped up by, you know, the challenge. But in the Great Recession, I saw that I felt like a prisoner. And so I was actually making notes to myself, like, why am I feeling like a prisoner this time and like a gladiator last time? That process of metabolizing my learning and keeping it in a book so I can always go back to it. It sounds like a journal, but this is not a journal. A journal is where you just sort of go and you write a bunch of stuff and it's free form. A journal doesn't have a ulterior motive other than to be cathartic and expressive. A wisdom book is the opportunity for you to metabolize what you're learning each week, and in a bullet point format, help to summarize that so you can go back and look at it later if you want to. So what I would recommend to anybody who's going through a difficult time right now is find a journal, find basically a blank notebook, and call it your wisdom book, and start to go through a practice of every weekend going through the wisdom book. That is a process of developing a growth mindset. Because one of the things that we need to ask ourselves throughout all of life, but particularly in difficult times, is how am I supposed to grow? What am I supposed to learn? What if this pandemic is just some kind of gift in camouflage, such that we're supposed to learn something from it? There's a few years ago, part of the reason I actually led to selling my company was I had a flatline experience. So this was 2008, August of 2008. During about a 2-year period, I had 5 friends commit suicide during the Great Recession, 3 of them entrepreneurs. One of them named Chip, one of them exactly my name. He was the guy who I really would go to for spiritual advice. And when your friend named Chip, who has a similarly strange name as you, who's the guy you go to for spiritual advice, hangs himself in a family, in the tree in front of the family home, to be found by his wife and two sons. Wow. And I was the one going to him because I was feeling depressed. I can tell you that that was not an easy period for me. Soon after that, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And soon after that, I broke my ankle playing baseball and became a bacterial infection and a septic leg. And I was put on a strong antibiotic and I had a flatline experience. I literally died at age 47, died 9 times over 90 minutes, had to be shocked back to life. And it was at that time that I was reading a book called Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's quite famous book on what it was like to live in a concentration camp as a psychoanalyst and psychologist who believed that meaning was the fuel of life. And what I learned from reading that book in my hospital room after being in the emergency room in the ICU that night, and I'd read the book before, but that night I stayed up almost the whole night reading it again, was that if you want to distill the most famous book ever written on meaning down to an equation or a mantra, it's despair equals suffering minus meaning. Suffering in a pandemic, in a recession, at a time when you're losing your job or you're worried about losing your job, suffering is ever present. It's almost like a constant. And if you're a Buddhist, it's actually the first noble truth of Buddhism, which is, suffering is ever present. So if suffering is ever present, and the equation is despair equals suffering minus meaning, this is the equation that I created, then what you end up learning is that meaning and despair are inversely proportional to each other. So the more you actually add meaning, the less you have despair. Let's do the math on it. Despair equals 8, suffering equals 10, and meaning equals 2. So 8 equals 10 minus 2, correct? Yes. If you could actually move meaning from 2 to 4 and suffering still 10, you actually decrease your despair to 6. So one of the things that I think this wisdom book allows people to do, and the premise of saying, how could I take a growth mindset and imagine, what am I going to do? How am I going to improve? What is it in this experience that is supposed to teach me something that's going to serve me the rest of my life? It's helping you to find a little bit of meaning. And when you've confined that meaning, you're in the process of actually reducing your despair. And why is it important to reduce your despair in a difficult time? It's partly because our emotions are contagious and there's a lot of despair in the air. Oh, I'm a little bit of a poet there. There's a lot of despair in the air. And so to go into some medical terminology, you have to inoculate yourself. You have to have a vaccine against despair. And that's what this meaning is. And there's another equation I'm going to offer here as well. And then we're going to get to questions in a moment, that I also learned, which is anxiety equals uncertainty times powerlessness. So there are at 98% of anxiety tends to come from 2 different sources. It's like the recipe for anxiety is uncertainty, and it's not plus, it's times powerlessness. These are the 2 ingredients that really lead to anxiety. So when in doubt, one of the things that I highly recommend is create your own little anxiety balance sheet. Create two little sort of balance sheet things. On one, it says, what are the things I'm certain about or I know? And then what are the things I'm uncertain about and I don't know? Similarly, what are the things I feel I can influence or I'm powerful over? And what are the things that I feel powerless about? And if you actually create 4 columns, let me use an example. I still am an advisor at Airbnb, and Airbnb today announced basically 25%. It's out in the public, it's in media, so I can say this. Airbnb announced 25% of their employees are being laid off today, which is a big deal for this company because the company has never wanted to get to that stage. But if you're somebody who actually is losing your job, and now you know it, for some people, I got to tell you, it's the data on this is very clear. For most people, before they lose a job, they felt worse in the 2 weeks prior to them finding out the certainty they're losing their job than they did once they found out they had lost their job. Because what the uncertainty does, it actually creates an emotional distress. So part of what a person could do is, if they're losing a job, is like, okay, now I know the certainty I'm losing my job. What's the uncertainty? Like, how am I going to pay for my bills, etc. So there's a way to actually start to look at, okay, what do you do? We did a study of 1,000 people with this anxiety balance sheet, and found that the vast majority of people had more things listed under things they were certain about and things they had some influence or power over. What was vexing or difficult for them was the 1 or 2 or 3 things in the uncertainty or powerlessness category. So in terms of sheer numbers, people had enough things to make them feel good about certainty or having some power. Where they felt problematic were the things that were not clear to them. So sometimes what you have to do in those cases is actually figure out, how could I create some certainty? How could I go to my boss 2 days before this announcement's going to happen and say, are you at liberty to tell me, whether I'm going to lose my job? Because frankly, the process of actually learning that is helpful. Because the thing that you can do once you have some certainty, and once you know something, and once you sort of have this solidity of something underneath you, is you can start planning for what's next. So let me finish up by just saying, how do you plan for what's next? Well, a growth mindset comes from the point of view that your skills can grow over time. There may be new areas. I like to call it same seed, different soil. One of the things we've learned, and my most recent book's called Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, and it led me to creating what's called the Modern Elder Academy, also known as MEA, down here where I am right now in Mexico on the beachfront, which is the world's first midlife wisdom school. It's a place where people come to help address their midlife transitions. A lot of people should be here right now, given the transitions going on for people. Unfortunately, we're closed till October because of the pandemic, but we'll be reopening then, hopefully, assuming public health allows for it. But the thing that I've learned over and over again is that people have skills they've developed over time that they vastly underestimate. There are talents you have. There are seeds, there are ways of knowing how to be in the world, and many of them relate to emotional intelligence that would be exceptionally valuable in a different industry, different company, etc. Part of your challenge in the transition is learning how to identify what are those skills and what are those sometimes intangible, almost invisible productivity skills that would allow you to go back out into the marketplace or the workplace and be able to offer it to another company. So let me sum up by just saying, it's not surprising that a lot of us get scared and go into a survival mode in a difficult time. And yet, when you are in that state of anxiety or in that state of not knowing, that state of being almost paralyzed by uncertainty, you actually are not operating at your best. Clearly, creativity is harder when you're anxious. Clearly, having confidence is more difficult. And often, this is particularly true for men, is we go into our emotional bunker and we don't actually seek out the emotional insurance from people around us. Who can actually help support us, but also help us to see some of our talents that we don't even know or we aren't conscious that we have. So with having said all that, Professor Conley is done. So I see a question from Jason Gant. What are despair equations? Well, when I said before was despair equals suffering minus meaning. And you can read more, but there's a whole chapter in my book, Emotional Equations, about that. So my last 3 books, I've written 5 books. The last 3 books, for those who are interested, most recent one's called Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder. The one before that was called Emotional Equations. And the one before that was called Peak, How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow. And it's about how to apply Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs to your workplace, whether it's your employees, your customers, or your investors. So why don't we open it up? And I think I can see almost everybody here. So on the screen. So you're welcome to raise your hand, and then we'll just unmute you and you can ask a question. Sound good, David? Perfect. Who has a question? And here's the problem. I can't see a lot of you because a lot of you don't have your video on. So if you don't want to, if you don't want to actually turn your video on because you're naked in your bathtub, please don't turn it on. Instead, be careful with having electronics in your bathtub. Instead, what I'd like you to do is just put a question in the chat. So who has a question? Either in chat or raise your hand. No one yet. All right. We'll give you a couple minutes. If we don't have one soon, I'm going out surfing. So, Z, is that you?
Yeah, hi. I'm curious about the emotional equations. I didn't know you had that book. I read Peak, and then I was aware of the Modern Elder book. But this idea of inoculating yourself with meaning and being able to tolerate greater degrees or prolonged suffering without despair. I'm so curious about that.
Yeah.
Inoculating yourself with meaning, what does that look like now? For me, that would normally be being around other people and interacting and having novel experiences and connections with people who I've not met before. But like, is there a
the good news there, Z, is that actually it is very much customized to who you are. So with each of the 18 equations in the book, Emotional Equations, I went out and I studied under the social psychologist or psychologist who specialized in that emotion, whether the emotion was disappointment or happiness or curiosity or despair and meaning. And when it comes to meaning, the things that tend to bring people meaning, it can vary a lot, but meaning and happiness are quite different. For example, children don't bring happiness, but children bring meaning. Now this is that's on average, and this is part of the reason why the low point for a lot of people in terms of their happiness is about the age when their kids are in early to mid-teens. And their happiness is lower at that time. And some people are nodding their heads saying, yes, they understand. But meaning is often something that has a longer term effect. So connections and social connections, feeling like you are connected to other people and feeling the depth of that connection is a form of meaning. To learn something, and this is why my wisdom book is a form of meaning, because if you can actually take what you're going through and try to make some sense of it, like there's a lesson to be learned that you can take into the future, that creates meaning. Feeling like you're doing something for someone else. When someone is in a place of despair, it often has to do with the self-absorbed cage that they're in of their own situation. And so there's a ton of social science that has shown helping people who are in that place of despair feel like they are doing something for someone else takes them out of the cage, but also gives them a little bit of confidence that they did something well and that they have something to offer the world. So I don't think there's any one sense of, or the right checklist of meaning, but those are a few examples. So thank you. Who else? Allie Bear.
Hi. Sorry, I've been running, so I'm not sure if you can hear me very well. Or...
We can hear you.
Okay. So, which is, I'm not sure if you're aware of the term or everyone else is, but my understanding is there's fragility, and resilience is where we go through something hard and then we bounce back. Whereas anti-fragility is you go through something hard and you change and you become stronger and become more so than what you were before. So in terms of a growth mindset, how would you interpret that in terms of anti-fragility, where like you grow and you become stronger and your muscles literally become stronger as we go through this crisis together? But can you share more about that?
Yeah, I think the anti-fragile perspective came from the guy who wrote the book, The Black Swan, if I'm not mistaken. Or he may not have started it, but he may have popularized it. I've not read the book, but what I know about it is the following: let's use muscle memory as an idea. Resilience means you are able to endure, and your muscle gets stronger, but it's probably the muscle is sort of in the same format, but it's just strong. Anti-fragile really speaks to the idea of almost learning new muscles that actually support that muscle. And so to move beyond the metaphor, it would actually mean learning new skills you didn't necessarily know you had before that actually create a stability for that predominant muscle or that predominant skill you have. So how would that relate to growth mindset? Well, it might mean having a bigger toolbox of skills to call upon in a downturn. Let's say, for example, that you thought one of your skills was you were exceptionally empathetic, and you're really good at empathy in the workplace. But you don't feel like you have a skill at being direct and decisive. So my impression of an anti-fragile point of view on this and how you apply a growth mindset to this is to actually say, okay, let me double down on the empathy because I know that, but right now I'm actually going to have to be decisive and, occasionally a little hardcore and not just sort of the soft and fuzzy. And I'm going to actually have to take a point of view of how do I grow my skill around being decisive or direct, when in fact those things are not easy for me, but they're actually what I think the workplace needs from me right now. And so that would be being conscious and open to be having a growth mindset, seeing that winning is learning, not winning. I'm sorry, success is learning, not winning. So you may initially not be doing it all that well. And so how do you actually build that skill then? You try to find some kind of person who can help give you guidance as a support, as a teacher along the way, so that you feel like, oh, okay, I have someone by my side who's helping me get better. We could call it a coach, but it doesn't have to be a formal coach. It could just be someone in the workplace with you. I hope that makes sense, Allie. Okay. We are going to move on to whoever is next with a question. All right, Lily.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, my screen froze up before. My question is, I love the anxiety is uncertainty times powerlessness and the anxiety balance sheet. Can you talk a little bit more about how, because there are 4 columns, so, and they're sort of similar, but can you just explain a little bit more about them?
Yeah, there's actually, by the way, I have a blog called Wisdom Well, and every day I write a little microdose of wisdom in the morning, and it's a free subscription, and you go on there and you get an email from me. And if you don't want to do the subscription because you don't want to get an email from me, you just go to Wisdom Well on the Modern Elder Academy website, and you'll see that there is actually a post called the Anxiety Balance Sheet. And so I'll explain it briefly, but if you want to learn it in more depth, you can see it right there. It's free just on that. So what you know, what you don't know. That's the first one. Uncertainty, okay? What you know, what you don't know. Now this is not just generally in life. This is specific to a particular thing. Okay, let's say the issue is my husband is cheating on me. I think my husband's cheating on me. What do I know? What don't I know? Okay, and then powerlessness. What can I control or have influence over? What can't I control and have influence over? So for example, on the control and influence, you could say, I can control asking him a question, a direct question. And that would actually also address this thing of what I don't know. I don't know that whether he's having an affair. I know the following things, but I don't know if he's having that. You could actually get a twofer on that one. If you went to your husband and said, are you having an affair? I mean, you have to put it the right way. And you could find out something that's an uncertainty, but also you'd have some power. A lot of times people don't realize they have the power to ask a question. Now, you may be scared to ask the question. I'm not saying that it's an easy thing to do. So I would just say, if you want to learn more about that, there's a whole, if you can either read Emotional Equations, there's a chapter in the book on anxiety, or you could go to the blog for free and just look at the balance sheet there. I'll give you another, here's another equation. I learned this one in Bhutan. So I went to Bhutan to study their gross national happiness index, which is sort of a weird thing to do for a CEO of a company, which was clearly I needed to leave Joie, my company, because I was going to Bhutan to study the gross national happiness index in the middle of a recession. But it led me to giving one of my TED Talks, which I gave in 2010 on the big TED stage. And the equation for happiness is happiness equals wanting what you have divided by having what you want. Or more simply, happiness equals gratitude, wanting what you have, appreciating what you have, wanting it, feeling good about what you have. Gratitude divided by gratification, having what you want, the pursuit of the thing you want. Now, in saying that, now, of course, in Bhutan, that's where I learned it, and Bhutan and America don't have a lot in common. But this equation is not an equation for success. It's an equation for happiness. So if someone said to me, how can I be successful? I wouldn't say to them, here's the equation for being successful, unless you wanted to perfectly equate success and happiness. Because I think the pursuit or attainment of things brings happiness. There's no doubt about it. But for most Americans, we are on what's called the hedonic treadmill. Once we have attained something, it doesn't mean quite as much to us, and we look for the new shiny object that we want to go attain. And that's a prescription for success, for progress, for all kinds of things. But it also can be a never-ending treadmill, painful experience of feeling like the only way I can ever be happy is when I get successful. And then once you've gotten your success, there's this new success that you need to attain. And so in essence, you're like that, the greyhounds following the rabbit, around the greyhound track. You can never catch that rabbit. So one of the things to consider in a time like this, where happiness is a contagion just like everything else, but it's not in high supply right now, is focusing a little bit more on where's the gratitude and a little bit less on where's the gratification. All right, let's see what else. We have a question from John. Hello, when you talked about your identifying skills you didn't even know you had can help people or companies in so many different ways. Do you have any advice for those who haven't found their skills, and how can you find those skills? Thanks, John. Well, two things. Number one is I hate going back to books and to the academy, but this is a big piece of it. Our Modern Elder Academy, this is what we do. This is our Modern Elder Academy, with 62% of our people are on scholarship. So I don't earn any money doing this. It's a social enterprise to help people in midlife figure out how to remake themselves. Part of what we help people to do with a whole series of exercises is how to understand underneath all of this on our surface, if you do an archaeological dig to what your mastery is and what you've gotten good at, how would you find that and then apply it? It's really hard in maybe a two-minute answer here for me to do justice to the answer. But what I would say is one exercise that we've done that is sounds superficial on its surface, but if you actually do it with the right mindset and in the right place, it actually can unlock something. Sit with a friend and do this reciprocally. Have your friend ask you a question and then you ask them a question. The question you're going to ask your friend and they'll ask you is, what mastery do you offer? Or you could ask the question, what mastery can you offer? If what mastery do you offer speaks to what you're doing now, what mastery can you offer speaks to something you could do that you may not be doing now. Your friend is going to sit in front of you, like maybe social distancing, 6 feet apart, and they're going to ask you let's say John, what mastery can you or do you? You determine whether you want to be can or do. Let's say it's do right now, because let's say it's something you already are doing, but you're not even sure what your skill or your mastery is. So your friend's gonna say, John, what mastery do you offer? And you'll say, I am really good at solving problems. Your friend will say, thank you, John. What mastery do you offer? And now you have to answer again, but you can't answer the same way twice. And he is going to say thank you, he or she is going to say thank you every single time you give an answer, and you can't answer the same way twice. By the time you get to your fifth answer, it's somewhat miraculous how you start to uncover in this archaeological dig what it is that differentiates you in terms of a talent, a skill, a genius that you might have that's unusual. When I did this exercise, I found that I was a social alchemist. Nobody had ever called me that, but that's actually where I got. When we did a similar exercise for this, but instead of asking this question, we asked, what business are you in? When we did this for my hotel company, we learned we were not in the boutique hotel business, we were in the identity refreshment business. When I brought this idea to Airbnb more than 7 years ago, we came to, and a month after I joined, we did an exercise on this. We came to realize that we were in the belong anywhere business. And that literally stuck, and it became one of the marketing phrases for the company. So the process of helping someone else help you to see that is helpful. Another thing you could do is, an exercise we do is like asking a dozen of your friends anonymously to reach back out to you. And the question, how you do this anonymously, is usually you have one friend who gathers all of this and then they tabulate it for you. Have that friend just say to you, especially if it's related to work, it could be work people, what is it that is just my natural talent that other people see me as a role model for? And what is it that I just am not very good at that I could improve on? That sounds really simple, but very few of us actually go through that exercise. And what you're going to find is that the thing that there's usually a lot of consistency in terms of what people see as your great talent. And for so many people, they don't even see that they have that talent. So thank you for the question, John. We're going to have time for only one more question, and then I've got to run. Who wants to be the last question? All right, well, if there's no more questions, I see David's come inside now. He's no longer out in the beautiful Mill Valley sun. Let me just sum up by just saying thank you for letting me join you. I hope it was at least illuminating in some ways that you hadn't thought of before, what a growth mindset could be, how you can think of your emotions in the form of equations, how you can look for that deeper mastery that you might have. And take a look at my book, take a look at the Wisdom Well daily blog, and take a look at the Modern Elder Academy. We're closed and we're not taking new applications till July, but the website's up and you can learn all about it there. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Chip.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us.